This is Bloomberg Law with June Grasso from Bloomberg Radio.
Today, I'm going to be sharing with you the best ever vanilla cake recipe. It's nice and light and fluffy. It's golden on the outside.
It may be the best vanilla cake recipe, but another baker says it's her recipe. Australian influencer and baking guru Brooke Bellamy has millions of followers on TikTok, and her first cookbook was a bestseller. But her recipes for caramel slice and baklava went from sweet to sour after another celebrity chef, Naji Mahashi, accused Bellamy of copying those recipes from her. And then yet another celebrity chef accused her of copying the vanilla cake recipe. Bellamy denied the accusations, saying she created the recipes over many years. But the fallout, the media coverage, and the online trolling have been so intense that Bellamy went into hiding. And Mahashi even tried to turn down the vitriol in an Instagram post.
Please stop the trolling. Now, I know I've made serious allegations, but this does not justify the personal attacks that I've seen online against Brooke Bellamy.
My guest is intellectual property litigator Terence Ross, a partner at Katten Muchin Rosenman. Terry, let's start with the legal basics. Can you copyright a recipe?
So, June, in theory, it is possible to copyright a cookbook or even a few individual recipes. It's very hard to do. It's considered one of the trickiest areas of the law. And the little bit of protection you do get if you're capable of getting a copyright is called thin protection by copyright lawyers, which essentially means that you've got to put the book on a Xerox machine and copy it word for word for there to be infringement. The problem here is that copyright doesn't allow protection of ideas, and a recipe, how to bake a cake, is simply an idea, and embedded in that idea are some scientific principles that are just required, and you're not allowed to copyright scientific principles either. It's got to be a certain amount of the ingredients to get the right flavor. It's got to be a certain temperature being baked in the oven, and those aren't copyrightable. And so it is a very challenging thing to assert copyright in a recipe or a cookbook, and about the only parts that can be copyrighted are sort of the expression of the recipe, so style, the wording describing what this cake is going to turn out to be, what this cookie tastes like, as opposed to the actual recipe.
I think buttermilk was used in one of these recipes in sort of a different way. So if you have a really unique ingredient used in one of the recipes that no one's seen used in this way before, what about that?
So copyright is different from patents in that what copyright protects is the expression fixed in a tangible medium, words written down. It doesn't protect how you do something. And frankly, here that wouldn't be protectable under a patent either, the addition of a different ingredient, in this case buttermilk. Again, that really does not help, although it pretty strongly suggests that there was plagiarism, and I say plagiarism as opposed to copyright infringement, that there may have been some plagiarism of the recipe that Ms. Bellamy was accused of copying.
So tell us about this recipe dispute, which has really gotten a lot of play, not only in Australia, but internationally.
So this is an interesting copyright dispute that came up in Australia. There's a very famous TikTok baking influencer in Australia named Brooke Bellamy. And she has over 3 million followers and is famous for posting TikTok videos of how you bake, tasty treats. She actually runs a chain of bakeries in Australia and has achieved quite a bit of notoriety down under, but also expanding outside of Australia. And so last October, she came out with her first cookbook, and it was called Bake with Brookie. And that's in part named after her baked goods stores, which are called Brookie's Bakehouses. But this book, because of her fame as an influencer in the baking circles, was an instant success. It sold over 100,000 copies in less than 6 months, gross sales around $4 million. It was the second best-selling book for the Australian Christmas season last year. So very, very successful. And just a couple of days before the Australian Book Industry Awards, which is a big deal in publishing circles in Australia, and her book, Bake with Brookie, was in competition for Best cookbook with a couple other famous, longtime baking experts. And one of them, Naji Mahashi, posted online that she thought two of the recipes in Bake with Brookie were plagiarized from her own cookbook, and laid out the arguments as to why. And this caused quite a stir. And then, to make things worse, Sally McKinney, a famous American baking cook with a number of cookbooks of her own out, sort of piled on and said that she thought that the vanilla cake recipe in Bake with Brookie had been taken from one of her books. And when you compare the recipes side by side, there is almost an identity of ingredients and amounts and cooking temperatures. But in the case of Sally McKinney's vanilla cake, she does something sort of unusual. She uses buttermilk. And Brooke Bellamy in Bake with Brookie, her recipe for vanilla cake also used buttermilk, which struck Sally McKinney's odd. So she brought this out, and it was sort of that point the oven mitts were off. Folks were chiming in and trolling Brooke Bellamy online to the point where she had to shut down her IG account. The press was camped outside her house, so she couldn't leave the house. She did not attend the awards ceremony for the book industry. In fact, the only time she's left her house since this happened last week of April was to go visit her lawyers, and she was followed the entire way.
Did Naji Mahashi file a lawsuit against her?
So there is not actually a copyright infringement lawsuit filed yet. Naji Mahashi has taken it to her lawyers, who have reached out to the lawyers for the publishing house that published Bake with Brookie, the Penguin Random House Group, and the two sides have exchanged letters apparently making accusations and denying accusations. And Brooke Bellamy, one of the few postings she's done, is a complete denial and an explanation that much of the recipe business, both in baked goods and in dinners, lunches, and things, all of that is derivative to start with, and you build on the same foundation, and therefore she does not believe that she did anything disreputable, dishonest, let alone unlawful.
But if the recipe can't be copyrighted, what are the allegations or causes of action you could even bring?
So it's not that recipes can't be copyrighted. In theory, they can be copyrighted. It's just very hard to do that. And to the extent that you have copyright protection, it almost has to be an exact duplicate of the recipe to constitute copyright infringement. A lot of what's going on here is moral posturing. There is this background noise that is being created that somehow Brooke Bellamy is not being honest, is stealing other people's works. Won't say being a fraud, but, that's the implication that people want to draw in a very competitive industry in which people are fighting for book sales and attention. June, this is not something that's new. The problem is that the law is so weak in the area, it almost invites plagiarism, if not copyright infringement. I mean, you take the very first U.S. American cookbook, very famous book called American Cookery by Amelia Simmons, who was apparently a domestic servant in a household in Connecticut in the early Republic. And she published this herself. She paid for it in 1796. And it was unique because it used exclusively American ingredients. It used American cooking language and put forward a lot of very famous, until that time, sub rosa, American recipes. So this was the first cookbook to have pumpkin pie in it. It was the first cookbook to suggest cranberry sauce with turkey. It was the first cookbook to use the word cookie. And it sold more copies than any other book in the early Republic other than the Bible. The problem was, as Miss Simmons said in her second edition, she wasn't making any money off of it. People were freely copying it and distributing it very widely. And the main reason she came out with second edition was to correct errors that the publisher had made that were pretty big errors regarding types of ingredients to be used and amounts and temperatures to be cooked at. But, historians have called this book the Second Declaration of Independence because it said to Americans, we no longer have to follow British cooking traditions, baking traditions. We have everything we need here to be Americans, even in our domestic household. It was very influential with women. And yet, there was massive plagiarism for 50 years, to the extent where people were starting to substitute out her name, so she wasn't even getting credit. You flash forward in time, and you come to 1984, and you have this famous case between Richard Olney and Richard Nelson. Richard Olney had written a number of French recipe books in English, very influential in bringing French cooking to America. And Richard Nelson came out with a new book on American French recipes, I think it was called. And Richard Olney said, well, wait a minute, I count 39 recipes that you took out of my book. And he actually filed a lawsuit. And the defendant agreed to the entry of an order stipulating that there had been infringement. So it wasn't aggressively litigated. He just wanted to get rid of the lawsuit and entered into a stipulated order. But there's a case where a copyright lawsuit was actually filed. You flash forward in time to 2021 in the UK, and the publishing house Bloomsbury withdrew what was a really enthusiastically expected new book on Singaporean recipes by Elizabeth Hay. And another Singaporean chef, Sharon Wee, had alleged that most of the recipes were taken from an older book by her. And the publishing house withdrew the work. They'd already printed some 17,000 copies and were ready to go to market. And just the mere suggestion that there had been copyright infringement caused them to withdraw the work and not publish it, in effect. So we have this long history of disputes over recipes and cookbooks, despite this whole legal area being sort of a gray area as to whether or not there is protection, there's not protection, what's protected, how much do you have to take to get protection, how much do you need to take in order to be able to bring an infringement lawsuit. But they keep coming up, every decade or so, and this dispute with Brooke Bellamy is just another example of that down under this time. But the substantive law of copyright is the same under Australian, U.S., UK law when it comes to cookbooks and recipes. And so it's just interesting to see this flare up from time to time across the different continents.
The one I remember is the one involving Jessica Seinfeld was sued over a children's cookbook.
Absolutely. Another great example. There, the lawsuit was actually filed. The way the expression was written up in the cookbook, there was a little bit more meat for the copyright infringement lawsuit. But remember who won that case. The defendant actually got a judgment in her favor, saying that this was not protected work. But again, another example of an attempt to use copyright law to achieve some sort of intellectual protection for recipes and cookbooks. But I think this will just continue on because there is no certainty in this area.
So if Najee Mahashi came to you and said, take my case, I want to sue, would you take the case? What would her chances be?
I think I would say that your chances of getting ultimately a verdict for damages in a copyright infringement lawsuit would not be good. However, Australia does have one feature in its copyright law that the United States law does not have, this notion of moral rights. When you use somebody else's work in this way, you have to give them credit, or you've committed a separate unlawful action, which is at least remediable by an injunction requiring that credit be given where credit is due. And so there is that option. But my advice would be to go about it exactly the way Najee Mahashi's listeners are going about it. You bring up the issue with the publishing house, and you say, look, we think there's a problem here, and see what they say. And then if they deny it, you have a basis to take that to the court of public opinion as being done here and see what happens. Because after all, a lot of what's going on here has to do with competition within the cookbook field. And there's this general perception that you should not be plagiarizing other people's recipes. But if you choose to do so, you ask permission and give credit. And I cannot tell you, June, how many potential copyright cases I've been able to avoid on behalf of my clients simply by telling them, look, say you're sorry and give full credit. Because at the end of the day, that's often what it's all about. They just want to be recognized as this was their creation, this was their work. And especially in this field of cookbooks, recipes, permissions are often granted to allow someone to use another person's recipe. You just have to ask and then give credit. And I think that's the big lesson to be learned here with respect to copyright law in the context of cookbooks and recipes.
Because it seems like the damage has already been done here. I mean, she's hiding in her house.
I think this is probably an enormous financial hit. Certainly it's bound to affect sales of her book, Bake with Brookie. She's taken down her social media. And when you have a large portion of your persona wrapped up as an online influencer in the social media forums, to have that simply disappear is not just, personally hurtful to you. It's financially damaging. Because they are, with that many followers, they are able to monetize that amount of followers, and all that money is being lost as well. So the damage has probably been done, regardless of whether you need a lawsuit to be filed. And we'll just have to wait and see whether Ms. Mahashi does follow through with a lawsuit.
And the repercussions for Bellamy seem to be continuing. Thanks so much, Terry. That's Terence Ross of Katten Muchin Rosenman. And that's it for this edition of the Bloomberg Law Show. Remember, you can always get the latest legal news on our Bloomberg Law podcast. You can find them on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and at www.bloomberg.com/podcast/law. And remember to tune into the Bloomberg Law Show every weeknight at 10 p.m. Wall Street time. I'm June Grasso, and you're listening to Bloomberg.